Робополис БГ. Добре дошли в света на роботите за дома и офиса, градината и басейна. Богат избор на роботи за почистване на прозорци, самообслужващи се прахосмокачки роботи с моп, роботи-косачки и роботи за басейни. Всички модели са налични. Робополис БГ. Доверете се на опита.
От студио Резиста Мартин Карбовски, София, гледате трансатлантическа видеовръзка с западния бряг на Съединените щати. В предаването ще видите. Бенджамин Абелоу е автор и изследовател от Съединените американски щати. Има бакалавърска степен по европейска история и е доктор по медицина от Йелския университет. Работил е във Вашингтон и е лобирал в Конгреса относно политиката за контрол на ядерните въоръжения. За последната книга на Абелоу «Как Западът провокира войната в Украйна», Ноам Чомски пише: много добре написана книга. Разглежда проблем, който би трябвало да бъде по-добре познат. Джон Миршаймер добавя: задължително четиво за всеки, който има желание да разбере истинските причини за катастрофата в Украйна. Авторът привежда ясни и убедителни аргументи в подкрепа на извода, че главните виновници са Съединените щати и техните съюзници от НАТО. А Дъглас Макгрегор обобщава за Абелоу и книгата му: насъщно четиво за всички загрижени за националната сигурност на Съединените щати и за мира в Европа. Hello, Mr. Abelou. Thank you for accepting my invitation. How are you? Where are you?
I'm okay. I'm in the United States. I'm in the state of Massachusetts.
This is your book on Bulgarian language. I accept a little bit bigger book, but you have no time to do this. I want to say that on Bulgarian social network, there are a few rare opinions that you should be in prison because of your book. How the West bring war in Ukraine. What do you think for these opinions?
I think on the first hand, there are a lot of people who have very strong feelings about the war. I would say especially on the side of continuing the war. So in some ways, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised to hear that there are some people who feel that way. On the other hand, I think it's very important that this is an important issue that affects all of us, and that we have to think clearly and rationally about it. I would also say that there are many people who believe that continuing the war is in Ukraine's benefit. I think the stronger case is that stopping the war is in Ukraine's benefit. There have been people who have wanted to continue the war from the start, and the situation has only gotten worse and worse for Ukraine. More lives have been lost, more people have been maimed, the population has been dispersed to other countries, more and more land has been lost. So in some sense, the attempt to improve Ukraine's situation, I'm convinced, has actually worsened it. And I think that situation continues now, where if the war continues, there'll simply be more land lost, more lives lost, and in the end, there'll have to be a negotiated settlement from an even worse position.
When does a country have a reason to start a war?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I don't know what in terms of moral justice, these are very difficult questions because there's always innocent lives that are being lost. I can talk about from a geopolitical point of view how countries do act. And in that regard, I'm not trying to justify the invasion or say that it was the right thing, but I'm saying that it was something that could have been anticipated and expected. And if the situation had been reversed, and let's say Russia or China had pushed up against the borders of the United States, let's say they had formed an alliance with Canada or Mexico and started arming those countries, I can certainly tell you how the United States would have reacted. It would have reacted very aggressively. So, in terms of what should have been understood, how Russia would react to how the West acted, I think the whole thing was predictable and very regrettable.
You remember the Cuban crisis. Do you remember the Cuban crisis? Is the same situation?
I think there are a lot of similarities. In fact, that really, the example I just gave of China and Russia on the US border, that's kind of a hypothetical example. But the Cuban Missile Crisis comes pretty close to an actual example of how the US did act. This was an attempt by the Soviet Union to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. And the United States almost started a nuclear war to get those missiles removed. So, whether we like it or not, countries that are in a position to resist do not like foreign powers pushing up against their borders in a way they perceive to be a military threat.
But what is the concept of the USA to start a war?
I think one concept would be in the U.S. there's a doctrine called the Monroe Doctrine, which basically declares it's an old doctrine, and some of the interpretations have changed. But
Yeah.
the basic interpretation is that no foreign power that poses a potential military threat can actually place military forces anywhere in the entire Western Hemisphere. So this is what the US often has in the back of, when I say the US, of course, I'm talking about the elite, the political leadership, the military. I'm not talking about typical citizens.
Mm.
So this is what the political and military elite have in their minds. Yet when it came to Russia, they felt it was not going to be a problem to push right up to Russia's border, even into Ukraine, which shares a 1,200-mile border with Russia. And of course, during World War II, that was an area through which, the Germans invaded. I believe Napoleon may have come through that same route also, a century earlier. But, these were massive deaths for Russia. In World War II, Russia lost 12.5 million citizens. It's actually one in every seven Russian citizen died in that invasion. And, we have to keep in mind how this shapes the mindset and the mentality of a country in terms of their perception of a threat. Uh, there are countries that border on Russia, the Baltic countries, of course. Poland had a similar experience. There are many countries that had very difficult experiences with the Soviet Union, and it's important to take their security concerns into account as well. But I think the West and many countries in Europe, certainly the United States, made a serious mistake when they thought that they could ensure their own safety by creating a situation that placed Russia in a sense of threat.
Let's speak a little bit for European Union. What happens? They promise us peace. We go in European Union. They accept us and they say will be peace on this continent. What's happened now? What's happened before 30 years?
Yeah. Well, it's a very strange and unfortunate situation. First of all, there were promises that were made. I'm speaking now of the time when the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War basically ended in 1989 when Gorbachev basically renounced the communist agenda of, aggressive expansion. But then, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Uh, at that time, in order to help facilitate the reunification of Germany, the Western countries promised that NATO would not expand beyond Germany, probably not beyond the midline of Germany, where the East and West were in place. So, really firm promises and assurances were made by many parties, and those were very quickly broken, probably starting in 1994. The first expansion didn't take place till several years later, but it seems that a decision was made as early as 1994. So basically, we've had a situation where the real reason for the existence of NATO, even, which was always a military alliance, a very powerful one, designed to oppose an expansionist communist regime, it lost much of its reason for existence. And in fact, the way the expansion of NATO was handled, it redrew the lines of division in Europe. Instead of having a situation of an integrated security architecture where everyone's security was taken into account, this was basically a continuation of the Cold War, and it reignited it. And many parties in the United States warned against that. George Kennan, who was actually the designer of the U.S. policy of containment of the Soviet Union, warned that the expansion of NATO would be the worst foreign policy disaster in the entire post-war period. And then very soon after that, a group of 50 very prominent military, political, strategic thinkers in the United States issued a public statement to Bill Clinton at that time, saying that NATO expansion would be extremely bad. And not only would it be bad in terms of Russia's security interest, they were arguing that this would create a situation that would destabilize the security balance in Europe and actually lead to harm to Europe and, of course, also to Ukraine, which is exactly what's happened. So, I think people often have a sense that, well, it's a matter of what the West wants, what the Western Europeans and the United States might want versus what's good for Ukraine. I think that's the wrong formulation. I think that both sides of this, Ukraine, the countries of, the Baltic countries, Poland, Western Europe, and the United States, their interests are actually aligned. And the best thing that could happen for the security of Europe and for the Baltic countries and for Poland and for Ukraine is a stable relationship with Russia.
But why? What happens now? Why did Europe adopt the cynical strategy, the official strategy, peace through strength? Peace through strength. This is official. Maybe the strategy is we will fight for Ukraine to the last Ukrainian. What's that mean, peace through strength? We are not strength in Europe here.
Yeah, it's a very strange situation. This doesn't respond directly to your question, but I think it's important to see. The European countries, especially Britain and France, were really opposed to NATO expansion. And in 2008, they were the two countries that most prevented the immediate entry of Ukraine into NATO. The second president, George Bush Jr., in 2008 was pushing for what's called a membership action plan for Ukraine, which would be an immediate entry pathway for Ukraine into NATO. And it was the opposition of France and Germany, especially, that prevented that. And at that time, they were very clear and they understood that the attempt to expand NATO, especially into Ukraine, would be an extremely dangerous and destabilizing situation. In fact, Angela Merkel even stated that she felt that Putin would see the attempt to expand NATO into Ukraine as an act of war. So what's so strange is that the initial opposition of the most powerful countries in Europe and in NATO, originally were opposed strongly and saw the danger of this, but then gradually shifted. And the most important change happened under Biden. And it seems to me that a lot of Europe followed the lead of Biden, who has had very deep conflicts of interest, financial conflicts of interest regarding Ukraine, that he's also been very involved in. He was involved in the attempt to overthrow Yanukovych in 2014. So that what's happened was an initial awareness by Europe that the expansion of NATO into Ukraine would be destabilizing and dangerous. They somehow started following the line that was being promoted by American leaders, especially under Biden. And then now now when Trump comes into office, and what everyone thinks of Trump, there's many people are strongly in favor, many people are strongly opposed, but whatever everyone thinks of him, he has now adopted a position that's much closer to what the major European powers originally thought in terms of the danger of expansion of NATO into Ukraine. Uh, uh, and now we have the paradoxical or ironic situation where those very same countries that actually were at the forefront of an awareness of the danger of this expansion have now started fighting against the plan that Trump has in place. So it's a weird turnaround. And although I see the European situation and the path of European leaders as being very dangerous and wrong and based on many false premises, I also do not exonerate the United States. We can't forget the fact that no matter what President Trump is saying right now, the US leaders, the previous US leader was the greatest cheerleader for this war in the West. So I think all the Western countries are deeply to blame. And ultimately, I think the United States is most strongly to blame. Uh, and again, we have to look at the destruction that's occurred to Ukraine because of these policies.
But this plan, 800 billion for rearm Europe. What is this? Is it real? From where is this money now?
Yeah. Well, I'm very far from an expert on the financial situation of Europe. My understanding is that the money doesn't exist, and that in terms of the short run, even if the money could be found and lead to a rearmament, it would not happen quickly. There's an entire military industrial base that would have to be built up and would have no bearing on the immediate situation in Ukraine. Uh, you know, the Western powers, I think, have really led to a great harm for themselves. One could even talk about a destruction of the power of Western Europe. We have the Western powers, especially Germany. I think it's quite clear, and we can discuss this in more detail if you want,
Yeah.
but to me, it's quite clear that the destruction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was the act of the United States, or at very least was done with the collaboration of the United States. And people sometimes forget that before the war even started, President Biden was at a press conference and said that if Russia invades Ukraine, we will destroy the pipeline. Now, Olaf Scholz was actually standing right there on the podium with him and basically no opposition. So it seems that my sense is that the United States is ultimately responsible for the destruction of Nord Stream with the acceptance or even collaboration of the then German Chancellor. Now, this has led to an increase in the price of energy, especially in Germany, but throughout Europe. It's led to a large extent, I think, to an evolving deindustrialization of Germany. So, and then, of course, the economic sanctions that the U.S. placed on and that the European countries have to a good extent placed on have also ended up harming the Western countries more than they've harmed Russia, it seems. Because Russia has good alternative markets in India, China, and elsewhere for their energy resources.
You say that for 30 years, the West has been provoking Russia to get the war now. Give examples of these provocations.
Yeah. Well, first, let me be clear that I am not at all convinced that the U.S. or the West, wanted this war. I don't know how it is in Bulgarian or with the Bulgarian translation, but in English, the word provoked can have two different meanings. It can suggest a deliberate attempt to create a war, or it could suggest foolish actions that led to war, but were not intentional. And I don't, my own take is that in the West, although there may have been some people who really wanted a war to sort of create a new Afghanistan, a quagmire for Russia, my own sense is that most of the people who were responsible for these foolish actions actually believed that they were trying to prevent a war. It had the opposite effect. So you asked about some of the actions that were taken. First of all, I think the expansion of NATO and the decision to break the promises that were given to Russia right after the end of the Cold War, that immediately created a situation of mistrust. Then you had the elimination of the U.S. backing out of two very important nuclear arms treaties. In 2002, the U.S. withdrew unilaterally from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And then I think it was 2019, the U.S. withdrew from the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. And that both of these placed Russia in a situation where it felt it increased vulnerability to a first strike from nuclear weapons. So we have this arms control piece that's often not talked about or thought about. Then you have, as I said, the violation of promises that were given to Russia about the expansion of NATO, leading to the ongoing expansion of NATO, with tranches of expansion occurring in 1999, 2004, 2008. Where the promises started to be given to Ukraine that they could join. So we have basically an increasing encroachment on Russia's border by a massive foreign, and when I say foreign, I mean primarily the US, a massive foreign military alliance moving to and toward Russia's border, carrying out multiple military exercises right on the border. So, for instance, in 2021 and in 2020 and 21, led by the U.S. within Estonia, right on Russia's border, a series of missiles were fired off to practice destroying air defense targets inside Russia. Now, they weren't actually looking to start a war with Russia. They were asking the question, what can we do to defend against a possible Russian attack if Russia decides it wants to invade the Baltic countries? Nonetheless, these were missiles that, although they did not enter Russian airspace, they had a range that allowed them to enter Russian airspace. These were live fire exercises where the missiles actually took off, and they were specifically targeting defensive targets inside Russia. Again, as part of a defensive strategy for the West, but part of that defensive strategy called for the ability to destroy defense targets inside Russia. So we have this expansion of NATO. We have bilateral, that is two-sided, between Ukraine directly and other countries. So you had, even aside from NATO, you had the United States forming military alliances with Ukraine and, in fact, bringing them up toward NATO military standards. So that was happening. And then let me just think if there's something else that's really worth mentioning at this point. You had the United States also supporting the forces within Ukraine, the far-right forces, the quote-unquote ultra-nationalist forces. Some refer to them as the fascist forces within Ukraine as part of a U.S. strategy to destabilize Russia. That is, the U.S. trying to act through the extreme elements within Ukraine, tried to shift Ukrainian politics in a direction that would create animosity between Ukraine and Russia. Many people don't know that for most of this recent history, the majority of the Ukrainian population did not want to join NATO. And people will sometimes think that this war started in 2022. Well, it actually started probably, we could say, in 2014, when a US-backed, first there was the peaceful opposition against Yanukovych for all the corruption and some discontent about not signing the association agreement. But that was followed, actually, people don't always separate this out, but we actually had a nonviolent, largely democratic opposition protest movement that actually was followed by a violent coup carried out by the Ukrainian far right. And that coup, some people have suggested that maybe the CIA was directly involved in that. I don't think there's strong evidence one way or the other. I think if that happened, we may never know about it, but it may not have happened. But it's definitely clear that the U.S. was supporting the opposition movement within Ukraine that laid the foundation for this violent coup. We know that for certain because in 2013, Victoria Nuland, who was a senior State Department official, I believe she was the number 3 State Department official, in a public talk, and I give the link for this in my book, in a public talk said that the U.S. had funded $5 billion of what is sometimes referred to as democracy promotion, but is actually often understood to be part of a regime change operation. Now, these were probably nonviolent movements, but they laid a foundation to try to mobilize voices within Ukraine, and again, laid a foundation for this violent coup. So there were many different pieces coming together. I think I and other people will sometimes just talk about NATO expansion. Well, it's a convenient shorthand to blame it all on NATO expansion, but there were really many things coming together, including also bilateral military agreements, including the withdrawal of the U.S. from arms treaties that made Russia feel a sense of threat, including backing of a regime change movement within Ukraine. And again, this is all happening right on Russia's border. I mean, you probably know what kind of craziness went on in the U.S. when during his first term, Trump, the Russians were claimed to have been involved with Trump in shifting domestic politics. Actually, it's turned out that most of that has proved to be not true. But we saw, my point simply is that the strength of the opposition within the US to the idea that a foreign power might in some way meddle with the internal politics of the United States created tremendous opposition. People were analogizing it to Pearl Harbor. So here we have, right on Russia's border, an attempt by the US government, definitely out in the open through forces like the National Endowment for Democracy and for the the Agency for International Development, was definitely trying to promote regime change, trying to promote political change within Ukraine right on Russia's border. And, we have to look at how, again, how the U.S. would respond to that situation in order to get some sense of how Russia might have perceived this as a threat.
But explain me why United States want 1 week Russia? Why United States didn't invite Russia in NATO?
Uh, that's a very good question. The, I think that the primary reason is that there were very important voices in the United States. Well, it's complex. Let me try to break it up into pieces. Number one, there were some important voices in the United States that continued to view Russia through the exact same lens that were used to view the Soviet Union. And we also see this within NATO. For instance, if you look at statements by Kaja Kallas, the former Estonian prime minister,
Yeah.
who is now the High Commissioner of Foreign Policy for the EU. I just last night I read a talk that she gave in late 2024 where she basically said that the evil of the Soviet Union is persisting in Russia. And now, some of these people in the Baltic countries have very horrible personal experiences with this. My understanding is that Kaja Kallas's immediate family, that her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother in 1949 were sent to Siberia. Her grandfather was sent to a Siberian prison. So these people grew up with extreme traumas. And one can understand why, on a personal level, they would have deep emotional concerns. And those concerns need to be addressed. But the idea that Russia is the same thing as the Soviet Union and that it had some of the same objectives, certainly some of the same objectives as under Stalin, I think this is a completely misguided notion. And it's led to a kind of conflict that need not have existed.
But this is for Baltic states. I ask for United States.
Okay, so I think number one, there are some people in the United States who think like some of the leaders in the European countries. So you have one, at least a segment of the military and political elite in the US that has this kind of ideology, which I think is totally wrong, but they have that ideology that exists. Then you have the influence of the military-industrial complex, which are the financial interests of the arms manufacturers. Now, keep in mind, when you have NATO expansion, especially when you move into the countries of the former Soviet regime, they have to replace all of their military hardware because they're basically using old Soviet hardware. And in order to be integrated with NATO and operationally integrated on a military level, they have to be using Western hardware. And much of that comes from the United States. So you had a tremendous effort on the part of the military lobbyists to bring about an expansion of NATO and the arming of the European countries, basically having them, selling them an entire new armamentarium. Finally, you have a domestic political concern. When President Bill Clinton was in office in the early 90s, and the initial decision to expand NATO was made. That is, he didn't have the initial expansion until 1999, but the decisions were made starting in 1994 under Clinton. And he was aware of two things. One, he was aware that there was a strong U.S. constituency of families that had initially emigrated from the Baltic countries and from Poland, and that those people, in similar to some of the people who are still living in the Baltic countries, had a very strong fear of Russia and fear that it might be like the Soviet Union, and they wanted to expand and to have that NATO umbrella over their countries. And Clinton, primarily because he knew that those countries, that those East European origin population within the US formed an important voting bloc that he needed to try to bring over to his side in order to help him win re-election for his second term, that there were these domestic political considerations. Finally, there was also hawkish members of the Republican US Party who are criticizing Clinton for not being strong enough militarily. So he felt, again, in order to win election, he had to present a very strong, almost militaristic front. So you have these three forces. You have the ideological element of members of the US elite who believed the worst possible things about Russia. You had the influence of the military-industrial complex, and then you have the domestic political considerations especially under President Clinton, when the initial expansion decisions were made.
I think you mistreated the Russia. Am I right?
The U.S.?
Yeah, American.
I think at a minimum we could say that the America, it showed an extreme arrogance and disregard for the legitimate security concerns of Russia. And again, just to emphasize, I'm not saying that other countries don't also have legitimate concerns and that a solution has to be made that takes everyone's concerns into account. But when you have an expansion of a massive military force to and toward Russia's border, including into an attempt to bring it into a country with a 1,200-mile border right on Russia, you're asking for trouble. And that's exactly what happened.
Who asking for trouble? For me, this is Russophobic politicians. You say that Russophobic politicians are repeating old mistakes.
Yeah, by old mistakes, I refer to the initial movement to expand NATO and to violate the promises. When I said there in my book, when I talk about their repeating mistakes, so I use the phrase, I don't know if this translates into Bulgarian, but there's an expression in English, doubling down. It's an expression that originally comes from card playing, where you take a bet and you increase the bet. And instead of recognizing the errors that they made by expanding NATO and saying, in essence, look, we screwed up, we messed up. We need now to figure out a better security architecture, a better security structure that is not directly threatening Russia, including acknowledging their mistakes. these same leaders that led to NATO expansion now argued that all of the problems that have arisen as a result of NATO expansion are actually the result of Russian evil and Russian expansionism. So they basically doubled down on their wrong argument instead of acknowledging their mistakes and trying to address them honestly.
How evil are Russians?
I certainly don't view the Russian people as evil. And I think that even if one opposes this war in the strongest terms, one needs to recognize that the vast majority of the people in Russia's military who are fighting this war honestly believe, whether they're right or wrong is a different question, but they honestly believe they're fighting to defend their homeland. Now, I also believe that President Putin, that he has been subject to a great deal of Western propaganda. He's been called the new Hitler or the new Stalin or the new Tsar, and it's been argued that he's attempting to expand Russian territory in the same way that the Nazis tried to do leading up to World War II. Lebensraum is the term that's sometimes used. I don't think any of that's accurate. I think what actually happened is in response to a perceived threat from Western countries, and especially the United States on its border, Russia responded in a very violent and harmful way.
How? Explain.
By invading Ukraine. I think the Russian motivations were a response to Western actions. It was a response that, rightly or wrongly, Russia perceived as necessary to protect them against the threat, a Western threat, and against the possibility that Western missiles would be placed in Ukraine, and things of this nature. So I see the Russian position as one being very regrettable, but one that arose very predictably as a result of Western actions.
Could we speak? What's the future of NATO?
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I think it's very hard to know. I mean, initially it was argued that this military conflict was going to lead to the solidification of NATO to make it much stronger. You had the entry of new countries, Finland and Sweden, into NATO, etc. I think what may be happening now, especially since there are peace initiatives under Trump, is that may strengthen the forces within the NATO countries that also want to have a quick negotiated settlement. So it's possible that this will lead to more strife and conflict within NATO and an actual weakening of NATO. Whether it leads to the ultimate removal of NATO or the denunciation of NATO, I don't really know. I mean, my hope is that whether NATO persists or whether NATO's removed, that we can now honestly recognize that we need an integrated security system that takes into account everyone's needs.
To be honest, in Bulgaria, we don't know our needs. We follow your needs. You must understand. Yeah. Is there still a risk of nuclear war